Today's first topic is about the relationship between the owner, trainer, and veterinarian. And Dr. Scott Palmer, who has recently become the Equine Medical Director of the New York State Gaming Commission and is really doing a wonderful job and learning a lot as he goes, I'm sure. He's going to conduct this panel, and for purposes of the Welfare and Safety Summit, of course, we're not interested in that relationship just being harmonious and pleasant. We're trying to look at that relationship as how it can be structured to deliver the best decision for the horse. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Palmer, who will introduce his panel.
Thank you, Ed, and thanks on behalf of the panel. Thank you very much to the Jockey Club for having all of us here this morning. Yesterday, we heard a lot about some really important topics. We heard about the importance of data and using data to promote equine safety. We looked at the modern thoroughbred, and we reviewed dynamic changes that occurred during the bone while training and racing. This morning, we're going to take a fresh look at the company that puts the horse in the starting gate and discuss some of the practical protocols and internal controls that can be put in place to promote safety of the horse and the rider. My panel members this morning are Gary Contessa, to my immediate left, one of the leading New York trainers, known for his success in bringing 2-year-olds from the sales to the races. Most recently, Gary brought Uncle Si down to the Kentucky Derby, and you may have seen him down here for that. Next to Gary, we have Bill Casner, past chair of TOBA and president of Casner Racing. He's going to represent the owners in this equation. We have Clifford Barry, general manager of Pin Oak Stud, and serves also on the TOBA's board of trustees, going to represent racing managers. And my dear friend Foster Northrop is an accomplished veterinarian and member of the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission, who's going to represent the veterinarians in this group. Yesterday, Dr. Scolay reminded us that no stakeholder benefits from the death of a racehorse. And yet racing fatalities occur. Why do they occur? Are they inevitable? This morning, we're going to take a look at the role that our business model may play in this process and ways that we can make it better to make racing safer for our horses. We talk about racing stables. We don't ever really talk about racing organizations or racing companies, but I'd like you to think about the racing stable this morning as a company. I think it's a fresh look. It's a very important look at what we're doing, and it's important to be able to appreciate this structure because we can use this structure either to enhance the best intentions of everyone involved or to mitigate those best intentions, and the horse will suffer the consequences. So while the racing company is very complicated, the executive division of it is fairly straightforward, and you can see from this slide that there is somebody at the top. And the person at the top, we're just going to say that's the owner. Could be a board of directors in some cases, or it could be an individual. But this is the person that needs to set the tone for this company. Sometimes we have a racing manager in the mix, sometimes not. Sometimes we have one or multiple trainers with assistant trainers and veterinarians and farriers and a whole number of consultants that are involved in this process. But I'd like you to think about the owner as the chairman of the company, the racing manager is the CEO, the trainer is the chief operations officer, and the veterinarian is the chief medical officer. So with that lens in mind, let's take a look at things that we could do. Now, there are 4 steps to safety, but before we get into that, I guess I just want to make a reference to the Occupational Health Safety and Health Association Administration. This is a company that we're all very familiar with, an organization we're all very familiar with if you're involved in small businesses in particular. I think the important thing about this is that since 1970, that I didn't realize that they've reduced occupational fatalities by almost 50%, which I think is a terrific statistic. And wouldn't that be great if we could do that in our own businesses? The OSHA offers consultation services to identify workplace hazards and to help set up structures and protocols to reduce injuries in people. Don't we certainly have the same responsibility to do that for our horses? You know, we really do have an opportunity here because although racing fatalities are multifactorial, we have shown that the application of appropriate risk management procedures can reduce fatalities. And I think that the important thing is that we need to recognize that we have a responsibility to do anything and everything that we can to make that happen. And we can use the tools of this business company to assist us in that process. There are 4 basic steps to safety that we're going to promote this morning. Very simply, that safety needs to be right at the top of the list in terms of setting the tone for the company. It needs to be a part of the mission statement. The goal of every racing company is to win horse races, no question. But shouldn't also a commitment to reducing injuries be a part of that mission statement and be on the agenda at all times? The next part of the process is to hire people to do the same thing, people that share your commitment to safety. The next part of the process is to get educated. Learn about the risk that's out there in your stable. You know, what are you facing every day in terms of the risk for your horses? And finally, to create operating procedures and internal controls that promote safety by reducing that risk and improving communication in the company. So in a nutshell, that's where we're going today. Now, yesterday, Dr. Hanal did a great job talking about how to identify risk factors specific to your own racetrack. And I think that there are different types of risk factors. There are factors unique to the horse, some that are unique to the environment, some that are specific to training and racing. And that's the final one there that is probably one of the more modifiable ones that we can work with in this company. So that's where we're going to focus our attention. You saw this yesterday. Lisa has expanded on this in a terrific way, but these are basic risk factors identified by Tim Parkin. We used them in the task force work, and we continue to use these risk factors at NYRA to look at horse fatalities with our Equine Safety Review Board. But this is a very simple tool. Anybody can do this. You don't need to have access to any special information. You figure this out. Any trainer can go down through the barn for every single horse in the stable, or an owner, and can figure out exactly which of these risk factors apply to his horses at any given time in their schedule. It's a very simple thing to do, but it's a lens through which most people don't look, and it's one we really should be looking at. Okay, so this morning, we're going to use some common case scenarios. All these cases are cases that were real live horses that suffered racing fatalities in New York. We were examined by the Equine Safety Review Board, and we're going to use a few of these to talk about and illustrate the challenges that are inherent in exercising our responsibility as stewards of the horse in an intensely competitive business environment, which is really the core problem here. Overuse injuries in young adolescent athletes is a big problem in humans, and it's one that's been addressed pretty effectively. They've done some research in this area to identify the prevention of injuries in young baseball players, pitchers in particular. They discovered through doing some studies that the number of pitches thrown, the number of innings pitched by these young fellows was excessive, and it led to the requirement to have shoulder surgery when they're about 14 years old. So they instituted some guidelines that restrict the number of pitches thrown per inning and the number of innings pitched per pitcher, and were able to significantly reduce injuries. So do you think this might have some application to the racehorse? Well, here's our first case. This is a case of a 7-year-old thoroughbred gelding. And when you look at him through the lens of an owner or a racing fan or a trainer, this was a terrific candidate for a racehorse. I mean, he was in the money his last 15 starts. He won his last 5 races. But, you know, you really can't stop them. Why wouldn't you want to race this horse? This is a horse that people came out to the racetrack to see. It was a horse, a very high-profile horse. But what was his risk profile? Did the racing company that put this horse in the starting gate know what his risk profile looked like before this race? Was he a likely candidate for overuse injury? How do we define, where do you draw that line between where do you stop training this horse and retire him? Or how do you modify his training schedule to intervene, to allow his bones to remodel appropriately? So these are some of the questions that I'd like to ask our panel to start out with. In this scenario, what is the role of the racing executives in this scenario? How do we gather information? What information do we ordinarily use? Or what's the current status? How would you think, if you were racing this horse, Gary, or training this horse, what kind of things would be going through your mind as you look at him and consider his career management process?
Well, personally, not knowing this horse and not having hands on him, I think when you get a horse like this, 7-year-old gelding, you really got to think about what it's taken to keep that horse going on a regular basis. Is he a sound 7-year-old gelding? Is there problems that we're dealing with? It's a day-to-day thing. Has the medication increased? Or is he just a horse that's, been a rock-solid, sound old horse? It's really a difficult evaluation for a horse that's not mine. But this horse, communication is so important. communication between you and the vet, between you and your riders, to pick up the subtle changes that they show us. You know, Dr. Byers, God bless him, he used to say, you know, we're training and we're treating deaf mutes. And I'd like to take that one step further. We're training deaf mutes who act like football players, who really don't show you when there's an injury, when something's wrong. The injuries are very subtle and they're very small, and we really need to work time and a half to pick up those injuries when they're very, very minuscule, and try and figure out what that horse is trying to tell us. So every day, you have to just notice the changes in that horse on any given day, and you really have to, that's when you really have to take notice. This horse, I think I know the horse we're talking about, and he raced, once a month, and he was a very successful horse, and he was a very successful horse when he broke down. But again, you really have to look at what's taking him to that race, what you're having to do to get him to each race, and evaluate, okay, when is it enough? What have I done? What am I doing with this horse? It's a tough judgment call on a horse I haven't had hands on, but communication and really evaluation of what's happening with that horse in between races is so incredibly important.
Great, thank you, Gary. Bill, what is your thoughts about career management at this stage of the game with this kind of a horse?
It was very interesting, the structure you showed on the screen a little earlier with the owner at the top, the trainer, and then the veterinarians as consultants. One of the things that I think that owners have to, if owners are going to make the financial commitment, the emotional commitment to owning racehorses, I think it's imperative that they really become more involved in the management of those horses and in the decision process. Perhaps I'm unique because I came on the racetrack in 1963, 51 years ago, and I made my living at the racetrack until I was 30 years old. So I did have that background that did allow me to understand the process on the backside. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on trainers. Their living is predicated on the performance of their horses. And so many trainers, they have a finite number of horses in their barn. You have a lot of stables where have 15, 20 horses, and they're struggling every week to make payroll, to pay the feed man, tack man, et cetera. And they walk down that shed row every day, and they're dealing with problems. That's what training racehorses is. It's dealing with problems. And then you have to deal with the owners. And so they walk a fine line. How much information does that owner want? How much each owner is different. What's that owner's ability to process the information? It has to become an educational process, I think. I think part of the role of a trainer is educating his owners and keeping him informed and making him a part of the decision process. And then I think it's imperative for that owner to accept that responsibility. Owen Hardy and I have a great relationship as far as training. He gives me all of the information. One of the toughest things is for a trainer is to train for an ex-trainer. But we look at it as a team effort, and hey, I provide the horses, and as a team we're trying to maximize the value and the performance of those horses, and at the end of the day, probably one of the most important things is understanding that every one of these horses is going to be having problems, and that if you address those problems in the short term, it gives you a much better advantage to maximize the career potential of that horse. And I think so many times trainers feel pressure to continue to work through problems when, in effect, perhaps it might be the best thing for the horse, the best thing for the whole stable to stop on that horse give him a bit of time. That horse may only need 30, 60, 90 days. And that horse comes back and he's healed up. He's a happy horse. He's much more into the game, and he has a higher potential of achieving his genetic potential. So information is absolutely, I think, in communication between a trainer and an owner is one of the most important things. And I would just encourage all owners to continue to ask questions, to try and learn, to become more involved in the decision process on the management of that horse. I've heard the analogy that, every vet tells you that generally there is always an underlying pathology that precedes any catastrophic injury. I've heard the comparison to the peanut package with the small tear in it. You're trying to tear that peanut package open, and you find that little small cut, and hey, it's easy to open. Well, that's, I think if we catch that small tear in those horses early on, we stop on them, let them heal, and we have the best advantage to maximize that horse's career.
Thank you, Bill. Clifford, tell us a little bit about your role, and maybe you've got an owner that really runs his own business. He doesn't have time to become involved in the stable, and he says, I need somebody to help manage this stuff for me. I don't want to have anything to do with it. I just want to go in that winner's circle. I love to go to the races, and I need some help. So tell us about your role and how you help that out.
I think this is, I'd be like the middle person here, communicating between a trainer and an owner, and without having to go back and repeat what Gary and Bill have said here. Communication is huge. Absolutely. I'm not saying you've got to talk to a trainer every day. We're very, very fortunate. I've got a good relationship with the trainers that we work for, but there's a twice a week communication. Each individual horse is talked about. There's a weekly vet report sent in on each individual horse. And it's important for, as a racing manager, to know that veterinary history, because how can you make a calculated decision on a horse's career if you don't know the past 60, 90 days of medication or issues the horse is having, and you hope that you're working with a trainer that is very communicative. I mean, that's what you need to do. And then you've got the temperament of the owner to worry about. I mean, you've got to, not every owner is going to take some bad news on a weekly basis, and that's very important to educate that owner to what's in front of us with an older horse like this, and be able to discuss that horse's career and what the actual risk could be if we keep pressing on here every 3 weeks, or we need to give it a break, and we know it's going to be cost X amount of dollars to give it a break. But I think that's a part of a racing manager's job, to be the middle person, to be the buffer for that trainer, and to be the buffer for the owner too. I mean, I think that's where that comes from.
Foster, what's the role of the veterinarian in this case?
Well, without repeating what everybody has said, the bottom line is communication. The veterinarian's often left out of that communication string, and I think that's very important. Every situation I've ever been in that involved the owner, the trainer, and the veterinarian in direct communication is very smooth, usually. A leading surgeon here once told me that it's interesting that the weanlings are x-rayed from nose to tail, the yearlings are x-rayed from nose to tail, yet when they become racehorses, we're not allowed to x-ray them. So when that communication string is open, the veterinarian's role becomes more prominent and more acceptable, with the owner having direct knowledge of what's going on. Nobody wants vet bills. I totally understand that. I don't want vet bills when I'm dealing with vets, but unfortunately, it's a necessary evil, and and evil is really the wrong word, because it's for the best for the horse. That's my job, is to keep these horses healthy, and if you keep these horses healthy, injuries are less likely. And it's just constantly monitoring, and Bill's right, the trainer's under unbelievable pressure not to constantly give bad news to the owner, but if that triangle is more open with the owner, veterinary, trainer communicating directly with the owner, it's a lot smoother for the horse and more important for the horse.
Clifford made mention of using a weekly medical report from veterinarians. What do you think about that concept, and would that be something that you could manage in your schedule?
That would be very easily managed, and I think it would open the communication lines that, again, I just think are so critical.
Gary, what do you think about the concept of having a veterinarian provide you with a written communication that would be conveyed over to the owners or sent directly to the owners? What do you think about that communication?
I believe it would be very helpful. I think the owners need to be in the loop. And I'll tell you what, as a trainer, when you have more than just a handful of horses, there are times when you're, like I tell all my owners, I approve the vet bills at the end of the month. And I'm not gonna lie, every so often I'll get a vet bill and I'll say, damn, it's enlightening to see what we did with that horse that month. So absolutely to have a report from the veterinarian, black and white, so we can see what we've done. Because sometimes you forget that we treated that horse this day, we treated that horse this day. You're trying to think about 40, 60, 80 horses, and sometimes one slips under the cracks. But when I see those bills at the end of the month, it's very enlightening. I think it would be a very positive thing for the owners and the trainers.
Bill, what do you think about the use of a weekly report?
You know, I think it's huge. One of the things that I think perhaps a lot of trainers are hesitant on are spending the money on diagnostics. X-rays are expensive, ultrasounds are expensive, but without definitive diagnostics, if a horse is starting to show you that he's just not quite right, you need to stop and figure out what the problem is. And it's extremely difficult for the trainer, for the veterinarian, the riders involved, because a horse can be a little bit off in his rear end, and where is it? There's if you spend the money on the diagnostics and you can really isolate the problem, then you can manage that problem. And at the end of the day, you more than make up for the cost of those diagnostics by the time you save and perhaps the preservation of that horse's career, your asset that you've invested obviously a tremendous amount of money in.
Okay, well, let's take a little bit deeper look in the situation. Yesterday, we did talk about some of these issues, the role of bone remodeling, the difficulties that horses have in remodeling their bones where they're in active training, the need for a period of rest to actually let the horse catch up to this exercise debt that Dr. Bramlin's referred to that can lead to fracture if we don't provide that opportunity. This is the chart for this particular horse, and you can see from the number of blue yeses in here that this horse had really hit the board in terms of risk factors. This was a pretty sobering review, and I think if the stable had this information in hand, it might have helped them make a decision about this horse. Anybody in the panel?
I think it's running yellow lights. I think the horse, Gary and Foster Clifford can address this. The horse will talk to you. He'll tell you, that there are problems. Now, some of these horses are more stoic than others. Some of them can absolutely deal with pain better than others. The outstanding individuals. It's amazing how they have this ability to deal with pain. But they will tell you. They may have a bit of filling here. It may be when they jog off. It may be when they go around a corner in a shed row. They'll tell you. But again, instead of ignoring that problem, if you constantly are trying to understand what the problem is, the depth of the problem, if it's progressed, and then try and make the best decision that you can, you'll avoid that. I can tell you, there is nothing that is more devastating to an owner or a trainer than having a horse break down. It just rips your guts out, and it makes you question if you even want to be in the game. And as long as I've been in the game, it's only happened to me a couple of times, but I mean it's a terrible thing. And so we just have to we have to make sure that we just don't run those yellow lights, that we're always trying to really understand the problem and manage it as effectively as we can.
Well, yesterday we also heard from Dr. Brown when she made reference to a paper by Dr. Esterberg that horses that have 35 high-speed furlongs in 60 days were 4 times more likely to experience a fatal musculoskeletal injury than those that trained 25 high-speed furlongs in the same period of time. Well, interestingly, this is a chart that we use in New York when we look at these horses through our Equine Safety Review Board to kind of try and get a feel for the accumulation of their workload on their musculoskeletal system in their career. We start from the moment they start training, we chart them right up until we come to the incident race and see if we can find patterns or things that would be of some concern. And Larry pointed out yesterday that he had done a study where he looked at some horses that had condylar fractures and some control horses that had very, very similar high-speed furlong experiences, and there wasn't a big difference between the two. Well, I think it's true, and I think we're seeing the same thing here. A lot of the horses that you look at here, this happens to be a horse that did have a musculoskeletal fatality, but and you can see that right before that happened, he had an uptick in his high-speed furlongs where he was completing about 3.5 high-speed furlongs a week. Now, one of the things that I did when I looked at this data was I felt like trainers schedule their training programs in weekly intervals. So taking a 60-day interval I didn't think was all that convenient for a trainer to use this information in a practical way. Also, high-speed furlongs per day is ridiculous as well, but the weekly accumulation of furlongs is a pretty useful number. And if you look at 35 high-speed furlongs in a 60-day period, that translates into 4.3 high-speed furlongs per week. And he's in what I would call here in the red zone at 4.3. A horse that accumulates 25 high-speed furlongs in a 60-day period is 3.1 high-speed furlongs per week, and he's more in the yellow-orange zone there. So I don't think we've got enough data here to establish a speed limit, if you will, but I think we're going to get there in terms of looking at this data and coming up with some guidelines to help us identify horses at increased risk of injury. It's very important when you compare the data that Larry looked at and you think about a number of horses that were in the same race that did not experience a condylar fracture and some that did, and if there's a similar pattern of exercise, why does the one horse get the fracture and the other doesn't? It's very important to recognize that risk is not a predictor, an absolute predictor of injury. There was a study done by Noah Cohen in Kentucky in 1991, actually, where they looked at horses that had suspensory ligament abnormalities in the pre-race examination. Now, these horses were not lame, they had no acute inflammation, but they did have changes in their suspensory ligament. And they made the decision the horses were safe to race. They sent those horses out, a large number of horses, and 3.4% of those horses did have something that caught the attention of the examining veterinarian at the time. This was also at a time when horses in Kentucky were racing on fetobutazone on race day, so medication may have played a role, but in complicating that examination. But only 1.6 of the 3.4% actually went out and had an injury that kept them out of racing for at least 6 months. So, you know, it's important to understand that this is an indicator, but it's not a silver bullet, but it's an important piece of information. Interestingly, too, if you take it one step further, you can look at this sort of a chart, and this is an accumulation of high-speed furlongs over the career of a horse. And one of the things that appears interesting to me, and again, it's a little early to say for sure about what's going on here, but if you look at the red line here and all these other lines, all these lines down here, the difference between these horses and that horse is that these horses are all dead. They all experience catastrophic injuries on the racetrack. This horse is still racing. He's completed over 630 high-speed furlongs in his career. He's raced for 230 or more weeks in his career. And one of the things you'll notice is different about this line is that these flat areas here represent periods of rest. And this horse had a number of approximately 90-day periods of rest in his career. And he's been racing for 5 years. This horse's career was such that they stopped training him or racing him in November, and they turned him out until late January and started him back up in February. And they did that year after year. And so while this is not a big research study that you can say has scientific validity, I'll have what he's having. I want my horse to do what this horse is doing. So I think yesterday we talked about the bone remodeling process and how 60 days is appropriate to achieve a certain degree of bone healing, but you're not quite ready to go back. We also said that 120 days is maybe a little bit too much, that then you've got a hard time bringing that horse back to the track from that period of rest. And ironically, when you look at this horse, he's got about 90 days of rest built into his schedule once a year for 5 years. So, I guess although we don't have this all nailed down very well, I would certainly think that this is not a bad model to consider if you're trying to, in your racing company, think about a structured program that could help allow horses to remodel those microfractures and to heal up and be more durable as time goes on. Okay. The next case, this is a case that was talked about a little bit yesterday. Mary in particular mentioned an emotional moment what she had when an individual had told her how they had basically sheltered their young horse, sheltered it from the stress of young horses, immature horses being trained, and then when she conveyed the fact that there was information to indicate that was not a good idea, it can be devastating. I've had the same experience. And it's a very, very important concept. And I think at the risk of being repetitive, especially for those of you who weren't here yesterday, this is a very, very important situation. So here we have a situation where there is information out there to indicate that this is a myth, that these horses do need training as a 2-year-old and racing as a 2-year-old in order to have a long career. There's some very good science behind this. I like this comment quite a bit by a veterinarian from the Royal Veterinary College that says that this kind of information correlates well with findings in humans that exercising the growing skeleton, which is more responsive than a mature skeletal tissue, has beneficial effects on long-term fracture resistance. How do we get this concept into the right hands to make good decisions? Gary, tell me a little bit about your experience with young horses. Are you aware of this research, and is it something that you talk to your owners about?
Well, now we have technology. Technology and diagnostics are just incredible. And this stuff is coming out every day. And the more I read, the more I learn. And the old days, when I was working for Laz, and back in those days, the only study out there was the New Bolton study that said if you worked a 2-year-old an eighth of a mile every week, you're going to strengthen her shins. And everybody's like, wow, this is great, we're going to do it. The diagnostics and the technology that's out there now, it's so important for trainers who are training now to learn about them and understand them. And it's just incredible. And it's there. The information is there. And we have to change our way of thinking. We can't just take every single 2-year-old anymore and think we're going to go an eighth of a mile once a week and suddenly that his bones are going to develop and everything else. The technology is there, and it's just much more deep. And we're much more informed now. But unfortunately, we're not all informed. I'm here today, I'm learning things in the last 2 days that are just incredible, that are off the charts. And we all need to take heed to all this information that's out there and learn better ways to train these horses and get them to the races. It's out there, and we need to do it, and it's our obligation as trainers to do it.
Bill, do you have any thoughts about, are owners receptive to this information, do you think, or is that going to vary from person to person? Talk to us a little bit about that, your feelings.
Absolutely. Information is power. And, again, I go back to the maximization of that horse's genetic potential, the preservation of that asset. And one of the things that we do, we try and we use some novel methods. You have to recognize that these horses are going to be exposed to extreme stress. When you start breaking them, one of the studies that came out of Texas A&M was that they start losing bone the day it's part of the remodeling process. And for the first 120 days, the bone, as they were talking about yesterday, Dr. Bramlage, was the osteoclastic activity increases and the bone starts to prepare for the remodeling process by removing old bones. So at 120 days, that horse, when you start breaking him at 120 days, he's probably at his weakest point, and then the process has to start going in the other direction, the building part of it. One of the things that we start doing is we start working with our short yearlings in February of their yearling year. We start swimming them. Of course, they get turnouts. One of the things that we've figured out is that if you keep them up one day of the week, when you turn them out, they'll go out and they'll give you those little short bursts across the paddock, and you get that bone stimulation. We use a fairly new technology. They're vibration plates that it's got a long history in human sports. It was developed by NASA for the space program. It shows that it does build bone. We put those yearlings on those plates 6 days a week. And what we have found is that when we start breaking them, we have a horse that's much more prepared for the breaking process. He's a stronger individual. He's gone through a process when his body is most adaptable to change in that early growth. And I think that's what a lot of this information has shown. When you start too late on these horses, their bodies have adapted to that lack of exercise. You have to really stimulate those systems in Mother Nature. So, it's recognizing that these horses are young, that they're young athletes, and that just like our kids, our kids go out and they start playing soccer when they're 4 years old. And the level of athleticism in this day and age, we look at these kids that are, the things that they're doing in sports now is just amazing. And it's I think part of that is attributable to the process that has started early on in their careers. Kids no longer, they start very early. They develop bone, they develop quickness and everything. So, it's basically the same thing. We have to look at these horses as athletes, and we have to understand that we have to prepare them. We have to really work at preparing them to make sure that when they start breezing, they're prepared for it and they're not going to injure. They'll overdo it very easily.
Clifford, do you find owners that would like to micromanage the training of horses that you have to address? And if do you have an owner that might say to you, well, I don't want to train my 2-year-old, they're too immature to train. How would you address that?
I don't think so. I think most owners as a whole, they hire a trainer as an individual, and they would be leaving that to the trainer, I think. I think it's tough to be kind of further down the table here because you feel like you're wanting to repeat what the guys in front of you have said. But I think if we back up here for a second, I think Gary said it best. We have got to do a better job as an industry educating our owners, educating our trainers, educating our farm managers. We're all guilty of getting into our own cocoon world every day and not looking outside the box sometimes. And I think there's a huge opportunity for our industry now, in this day and age of modern technology, for these licensed vets and licensed trainers to have some kind of a continuing education on a yearly basis. I think the vets do it. There's no reason a trainer can do it, and there's no reason a farm manager or a racing manager is not responsible to do that as well.
It's a terrific concept, and I can assure you the Jockey Club is working on that. We're working on that in New York as well. Many states, California, took a lot of positive steps in that direction, so I can tell you it's high on the agenda of a lot of people, and I think you're going to see that happen pretty shortly.
This is an evolving game, and we're learning new stuff all the time. And like everybody said, nobody wants to leave a horse on the racetrack. I don't care from any owner, trainer, farm manager, whoever it is. That's somebody's worst nightmare.
Foster, comments?
Couple of things. I think Bill said this earlier. I have so many doctors come up to me and say, how do you deal with a patient that can't talk to you? Well, they do talk to you. You just have to learn to listen. And science is great and science is necessary, but the bottom line is the trainers that I work for that treat horses as individuals and don't just put them in a set program that has worked for other horses are the most successful. So every horse is an individual. Every horse sometimes can't train as a 2-year-old, and there's nothing you can do about that other than give them time. And the frustrating part for us on the backside is you have a certain horse that's been in training. The best thing you could do for this horse is to give him 60 days off. You send the horse home. A week later, he's in somebody else's barn. So that's that's a major problem that I see more and more and more. And I think it's important, the early development of the, excuse me, the early development of these horses at the farms, I think is also critical, because I've been around long enough now, I can almost tell you where the horse came from with the problems that they come in with. You know, the horse has been breezing 3/8, and you get him into the track, and there's no way that this horse is ready to breeze 3/8 at the racetrack. Thus, you have to start all over. That's tough to explain to an owner without throwing people under the bus, and you know, we all try to get along with everybody. So again, it all comes back down to the communication and doing what's right for the horse, and the owners need to be educated better about why we're doing something that we're doing, especially with giving them time off.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next case. This is a scenario, another common scenario that we find in the Equine Safety Review Board findings, that we have a horse that has been showing signs of lameness. Maybe we see a pattern of medication administration over the last 60 days, not only during part of the race, but during the training program. This therapeutic medication is legal, it's appropriate, everything's fine with it, but we also know that, as Larry alluded to yesterday, that same medication compromises our ability to interpret the soundness of that horse, and it certainly can compromise the function of the pre-race examination. In many cases, and we did briefly talk about this earlier, where the diagnostic efforts just weren't there. You know, if there's an error of omission that we find commonly in these horses, it is that the horse was being managed for a condition and there was no imaging. So in many cases, we asked for the veterinary report for the last 60 days, and the trainer says, there is no veterinary report. No veterinarian looked at this horse in the last 60 days. Well, that's a problem, you know, right there. So, you know, how do we incentivize the diagnosis? You know, Gary mentioned the fact we've got a lot of new technology out there. Certainly it's expensive, and that's got to be a factor, but what can we do to improve disclosure, transparency? Gary, what do you think? How do we address this as a company?
Well, I think it started. I think we're starting to get in the right direction. We started with the graded stakes, you know, showing the vet bills and showing everything publicly and letting everybody see exactly what we're doing with these horses. And it's a start. I mean, we're certainly going in the right direction. But communication is everything. And let me tell you, as a trainer, communication is so difficult because everybody's scared. Like, I have 2-year-olds, but I also claim horses. I claim a horse, and I have no idea what the previous trainer has done with that horse. I can't access that horse's vet records. I get an owner, sends me a claiming horse. I say to that owner, hey, do me a favor, send me the last 2 months of vet bills. I want to see what's going on with this horse. But I claim a horse, I am in the dark. And I think we have to have transparency with vet bills. Trainers, as much as they want to keep everything hidden, we have got to become transparent for the protection of the horse. Communication and transparency has to happen. I'd be perfectly willing to show my vet bills on every single horse every single day, because I should be able, as a trainer, I should be able to explain what I did, why I did it, and to anyone at any time. I'm certainly not embarrassed to share my vet bills, but the training community is very, very tight knit, and they keep everything very, very hidden, let's say, and it would certainly help. We need transparency, and I don't know how we're going to reach that goal, but if we had transparency, we would have a lot less breakdowns in this game.
Okay. Bill, your thoughts about managing this horse?
Well, I couldn't agree more with what Gary just said. You know, when the owners understand what's going on with that horse, and when you have a public record of it, you know, there's a whole different process that goes into the management of that horse. When somebody's looking, when you know that somebody's going to be looking over your shoulder if something bad happens to that horse, and is going to go back and look at that vet bill, and if it's available to everybody, perhaps on that one horse that broke down, then it takes on a whole different light. When you have that information, you can just make better decisions. The horse that you had up there that had the long career, when I looked at it, the first thing I thought of was Wise Dan. Charlie Lepresky gives that horse breaks throughout. He's given it throughout his career, and he has really done an exceptional job of managing that horse's career and optimizing the potential of Wise Dan. He's a two-time champion, and it's again. I totally agree with Gary. The more information that the owner has available, the more transparency there is, the more accountability that we will have, and the better opportunity we will have to more effectively manage these horses' careers and reduce these catastrophic injuries. Catastrophic injuries, absolutely. We have to continually work at trying to reduce this, whether it's with management within the barn area, whether it's surface management. It's those when a horse breaks down in front of the grandstand at a racetrack on any day, people walk out of that grandstand and vow never to come back. I mean, we saw it with Barbaro. And we're still feeling it from Barbaro. I mean, we had people, 15 million people that watched it on television. And it has just a catastrophic effect on our industry and the future of our industry.
Clifford, do you think that the use of your weekly reports would give you a clue that something might be going on here if you saw a trend in terms of the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication without an indication that radiographs have been taken or an ultrasound have been done? Would you then
I would
use the
absolutely
information?
say absolutely. I mean, you'd have to be very well aware of medication that was being administered on a weekly basis for sure. But my golly, I would hope you would have enough of a dialogue with your trainer that you guys are discussing this before something like this would happen. And that's what's really, really important here. I mean, is to have that relationship with your trainer that's open and very transparent. I mean, you guys have got to be on the same page. I mean, from where an owner sits, the health and the welfare of the horse is of the utmost importance. And I think that weekly dialogue, not a text, not an email, but that pick up the phone and conversation, followed up by a weekly report. At least if you've got that weekly report in front of you, you can say, horse A, Gary, looked like he'd gotten 5-6 days of bute. Do we have a problem? At least you can kind of sit there and chat and talk about it, But I agree with the guys here. There's got to be some kind of a system, Doc, and I know we talked about this last night. There's got to be some kind of a central system that this medication administered by a vet is put in on a daily or a weekly basis. So when somebody claims a horse, they can click on there, have a passcode, leave a trace of who's been in there and looked for whatever reason, and you should be able to have a lifetime of vet records. I mean, I know in Europe, they've got horse passports, and any medication that's given or administered by a vet is administered on the passport. And there's no reason in this day and age, now that might not be able to happen 10 years ago. Everybody's got an iPhone, everybody's got a laptop. This stuff is instant anymore. More instant than you want, probably. And there's no reason that we can't do a better job taking care of that information on each individual horse, whether it's through the jockey club. I mean, we do it through pedigrees and race records and past performances. What's stopping you from clicking in there and going, horse A, here's his last 6 months, or I just want to see his x-ray details, or I want to see whatever. But that comes down to us as an industry wanting to be transparent. But like Gary said, there's a lot of that stuff that wants to get shoved underneath the carpet. No, it's not happening, and let them go do what they need to do, but that's wrong.
Foster, Gary used the word fear a moment ago when he was talking about, the fear that's inherent in some relationships in our business. You expressed a concern that there are times when you're not allowed to x-ray a horse at the racetrack. They get x-rayed everywhere when they're babies, but not at the racetrack. So I'm sure you appreciate that's a concern, and talk to us a little bit about how you feel about that, and what do you think we could do about that to change that?
Well, it starts with the CEO. It starts with the owner. If the owner wants to be actively involved in his stable, I encourage that. If the owner wants to sit back and let other people make all the decisions, that's his right also. But he has to allow what needs to be done and not get a vet bill or a training bill at the end of the month and get upset. So it all starts at the top. And there's got to be a better understanding when a trainer adjusts a training program versus another horse that supposedly came in, same owner, at a different level. The owner's got to accept that because time off will pay for itself down the road. Proper veterinary care will pay for itself down the road. And that has to become more aware in our industry. And I think a lot of that will take care of what Gary was talking about, and that is the transparency between the owner and the trainer and the veterinarian. If the trainer can be comfortable going to this owner and discussing all the fine details about his horse, and the owner has been educated enough to understand that things happen, I think this will be a lot better relationship. I mean, it all comes down to transparency and what's best for the horse. And as far as the claiming game, I'm all for, Gary being able to find out exactly what happened to this horse as a 2-year-old. And that's in the best interest of the horse. But that time off, when a horse needs time off, it's critical to get that 60 days. And it's amazing what 45 to 60 days will do for a horse. But before you send him out, you got to make sure you know what's wrong with him. And that's where the owner, direct communication with the owner, always smooths that out.
Gary, let's talk about another angle of communication. I know you had an experience that you were very concerned about in the wake of the task force investigation in New York, specifically related to the concern that certain exercise riders or jockeys have a perception that the trainer does not want to hear bad news, that if the jockey warms the horse up and he feels as though the horse is not right for the race, that if he scratches the horse or contacts the examining veterinarian, that there would be repercussions from the trainer. Can you share us a little bit about how you feel about that and how you've managed that?
Well, when I was thinking about coming here, I was thinking, what's the key word? And I think the key word for me at this presentation is communication. And when we had the breakdowns at Aqueduct, everybody knows that period of time, I had one of the first, but I had a filly, a 2-year-old filly that we thought the world of. I ran her first time out, she finished second in a maiden special weight. I ran her back about 6 weeks later in a maiden special weight, and we thought this filly was going to take us to the Kentucky Oaks. And she ran, and at the top of the stretch, she's making the lead, and she pulled up in distress. And when we x-rayed her, we got her back to the barn, she had shattered her knee in so many places. It was unstable. We had to euthanize her. And it was a terrible thing. I mean, when that happens to me, I don't sleep for a week. I'm sick. So it was kind of forgotten, and 6 months later, we had all those breakdowns of claiming horses and a very bad, rough time in New York. 6 months later, I'm reading the task force report. It's this thick. I'm just sitting home reading it. I think it's amazing reading, and I want to learn something. And my horse comes up, and the jockey says, this horse warmed up bad in the post-parade, but I was afraid if I scratched the horse, the trainer would take me off all his horses. I wanted to throw up. I was so upset. I can't even tell you. It still bothers me 3 years later. I don't even know if I can continue to talk about this. That's how much it bothered me. And I couldn't imagine how a jockey could say something like that. My God, this was my best 2-year-old filly. She warmed up poorly, but that shows you the lack of communication in this business. Apparently, this jockey, at some point in his career, scratched the horse in the post-parade for another trainer, and that trainer took him off all his horses. But that can't be the way it works. And you know what? For the last 3 years, every jockey hears, if you don't like the way that horse warms up, you scratch him. Every exercise rider that I hire hears, if you're going out there to breeze a horse and you don't like the way that horse is moving, don't do it. We can always correct that problem and breeze another day, but a catastrophic injury, you can never replace that horse. And that was just a terrible thing that happened to me, and it changed my life as far as communication. But that's a real problem.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Gary. I appreciate how difficult it is for you to talk about it, and I thank you for sharing that with us. Well, in summary then, we're getting near the end of our time. I think you've heard a lot of great comments here. You heard a lot of heartfelt comments here about the relationship that needs to happen, the communication needs to happen in this business culture. We can see how, I think, we've discussed ways in which in a very competitive business environment, the best intentions of all the parties involved can be mitigated, and the horse picks up the tab for that, and we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. I would encourage all owners and trainers to examine the safety record in their company, not just in fatalities, but in just in injuries in general, to know what their injury rates are. That's really the first step in this process, and to set a goal for the coming year to reduce injuries in your barn. And I think if NYRA can reduce their injuries by 40% by applying risk management techniques, I don't see any reason why individual stables can't do the same thing out in front proactively and prevent injuries from that standpoint, because we need to come at this problem for a number of different angles to be successful. It's easy enough to create a chart of risk factors. It's easy enough to go in Equibase and look at the high-speed furlongs and figure out, does your horse have the appropriate rest in there? When we look at some of these horses, even if you look at some of the fatalities, if you look at their whole career from week 1 to week 200, you might see that the ratio of a work week, that's a work in which there was a timed workout or a race, versus a week in which there was no timed workout or a race, that ratio is about 1-to-1 in a lot of cases, both in fatalities and in non-fatalities. But if you look at the last 12 weeks leading up to the incident race where a horse suffered a fatality, frequently it changes. That there's something that changes in that process. It's a definite manipulation of the training program where the ratio of work to rest changes from the 1-to-1 to as high as 11-to-1. 11-to-1 weeks of work versus rest. And in that environment, that horse is extremely high risk. That was a horse that died. So I think it's really important that we get that information, look at it, and use it in our companies to make our companies safer. The quick steps here: draft the mission statement with a commitment to safety, that it becomes a criteria for success in your company as well as winning races. Hire the right people, get the right people on the bus so everybody's on the same page. Learn about these risk factors and work them into your daily routine so that it should be part of your training book, so that you understand what's happening in your stable. In this day and age, there's so much information out there we just need to get educated about. It's really critically important. And to provide that open up channel of communication so a jockey feels comfortable explaining their concerns, a veterinarian is comfortable explaining the concerns, that we can all work together to address this problem. So I want to thank the panel for a great contribution. You guys have been very frank, and I appreciate it very much, and I hope you guys have appreciated it this morning, and I'd like to thank our panel members. Do we have a minute for questions, or does anybody have any questions for any members of the panel? Sure. Ed, can you get a microphone?
You and I had a conversation several weeks ago, and you were expressing concern that in the routine of the backstretch, sometimes the trainer is asking for medication, and the veterinarian is pressured to give medication without having done the diagnosis himself. Could you comment on that?
Well, this is a pretty hot topic right now, and especially in the context of recent media attention to this issue of the use of medication at the racetrack. Not only the use of medication by veterinarians, but the use of medication by laymen at the racetrack. As you know, a lot of medication is administered by non-veterinarians, and there's really no reporting of that information whatsoever. That's totally off the radar screen, and it's a hugely important piece of the puzzle. I think it's important that we take a different look at the use of prescription medications. And in New York, this is something we're studying. And I think that a simple solution to this problem is to change the paradigm, if you will, or the way that medication is managed inside that fence that encircles the racetrack. And Sonny Hine, who's a very famous trainer, had an interesting background. He worked for the WSS before he became a horse trainer and had some interesting ideas about life and security. And he said to me, "Scott, you realize that fence we have around the racetrack is not to keep people from getting in here. It's to keep us from getting out there." He said, so I mean, it's just an idea that there's a different way of looking at things sometimes inside that fence and outside that fence. And I think if the medication dispensing and the medication administration inside that fence was handled with the same scrutiny and the same accountability that's being handled outside the fence, that we would have a whole different look at this and how we manage medication. I talked to a veterinarian about 2 weeks ago who told me he was very unhappy with his job at the racetrack, that he had been doing it for almost 40 years, and he was frustrated about the fact that he was no longer a veterinarian, he was a technician, he was being told what to do, and he said, well, I just wish I could be a doctor again. Well, I think that putting processes in place like that, and it's going to involve using boards of examiners, and it's going to involve using regulatory measures, I'm sure, and it's going to involve a lot of discussion with trainers and veterinarians and to get this sorted out. But I believe that there's opportunities for us to make a big impact on that particular area. Question in the back?
Yes, thanks, Dr. Palmer. As a former, I'm not usually nervous talking in front of people, but I'm quite nervous right now because what I'm about to say is kind of controversial. So I'm going to sit down. Yeah. This goes all the way back to the second year of riding, 1975 at Pimlico Racecourse. I was on a horse that was not warming up well, and I took him to the vet, and he said, Chris, I know this horse, that's the way he goes, he's fine. So I warmed him up some more, and he didn't scratch him. He said, take him back to the paddock if you don't want to ride him. So I did. The horse was picked up by none other than Bill Hartack. Yep, 5-time Kentucky Derby winner, Hall of Famer. The horse won. So I had egg on my face for the rest of the meet. But the horse never ran again. He limped back to the winner's circle. Even though the egg on my face came from the older riders saying, you got to be tougher than that. You know, you got to have courage to do this. You got to have guts. But you also have to have common sense. I'll interrupt my comment by saying that I'm immensely pleased with the efforts that this organization and the Jockey Club have been doing for the last several years and the progress that has been made. I understand there's a lot more progress to be made, but you guys are doing one hell of a job. I have to take advantage of the fact that I've got a captive audience here with regard to racetrack managers, racing commissioners. Ed, there are way too many racetracks in this country that where the vet will send a horse back to the paddock when the jock doesn't want to ride it. That has to stop. I was known as one who would pull the trigger quickly. If a horse wasn't warming up correctly with me, I would take the horse to the vet if I didn't feel comfortable riding the horse. Thank goodness out in California, I never saw a veterinarian say, take that horse back to the paddock. They always scratched the horse if the jock didn't want to ride it. There was an incident at Charlestown. Should I not? No, I better not pick on anybody. Anyway, thank you, I appreciate it, but this is something that I firmly believe needs to be addressed because it's a huge accident waiting to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Other questions?
Scott, can I make a comment on that?
Sure, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I have one, Dr. Palmer.
Well, let's let the panel go ahead for one comment on Chris's comment.
Let me just say one thing. One of the most enlightening things I heard yesterday was from one of the state vets that said that early on they could be criticized for scratching a horse. And they said the climate has changed where now they can be criticized for not scratching that horse. And Chris, I was part of the era that you rode in, and that's one of the things that I really feel that has changed is our awareness. And there is no better example than this conference. This is either the third or fourth conference, and just wonderful things have come out of this. But each time we have one, there is more of an emphasis of doing the right thing for the horse and the right thing for the rider. And I immensely appreciate your comments, Chris, because I think it frames frames our problem. If we're unwilling to accept and recognize our problems, we can't deal with them. So again, thank you for your candor.
I think it's really important for especially owners to understand it's amazing how much can happen at the last minute. And jockeys and trainers are put in a position with the owner where they look bad because they brought an unsound horse over there, even though the horse was sound walking over there. It's sometimes hard to believe, but it happens a lot. And what I want, my big point today is, as our regulatory veterinarians have gotten stronger and better over the few years, they take a tremendous pressure off of that jockey to make that bad decision, off of the trainer to lead one over there that's not quite right. And I commend them, and I commend them frequently. They're doing a phenomenal job, and they are the jockey and the regulatory vet are the last chance a horse that's in danger has. And that danger could have developed that quickly. So I commend our regulatory vets, and like Chris says, the jockeys need to stand up when something's not right, and it's always in the best interest of the horse.
Question
make
over here.
one quick comment on that, and I guess we just, before we, and this is, Chris, probably pretty controversial itself, I think the one thing we cannot do is mask anything race day for those regulatory vets. That's very, very important.
Other questions? Go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Palmer. I just wanted to add on to Gary's comments. I absolutely applaud the thinking of increased transparency. We think that's an absolutely wonderful goal to aspire to. And likewise, we applaud the increased transparency efforts that are underway in New York that does anything but strengthen that owner-trainer veterinarian triumvirate in terms of improving communications and so forth. So your comments and your remarks are greatly appreciated from our perspective. And likewise with Massachusetts, for example, in their efforts to increase transparency and views into the horse. We would also offer, and we just wanted to add a comment here at the end, that we also think the transparency efforts extend also to the customer as well. And it's a pilot project that we undertook a couple of months ago where we looked at testing the interest among the community of owners and trainers in making medical records available to the general public. And we recognized it was something that was new. We wanted to experiment with it. And Scott, as you know, you guys have been doing it up in New York as well. And we were very pleased with the response in the pilot. We had 134 owners that have pledged to make their records available, and likewise 61 trainers as well. And we think it's just a tremendous effort that we are now going to build out a little bit more. And what's up on the screen is just simply a demonstration of that website and where it's available at horseracingreform.org. It lists, this is in particular, is a list of the individual owners and trainers that have pledged to make those records available. And then there's another screen that would show just the extent of the records and what's out there. So again, we applaud it. We think it's transparency is something we should all aspire to. And that's conclusion of my comment on that.
Thank you, Matt. Foster, you had a comment?
As a veterinarian, I have nothing to hide. I'll give my records to anybody in a legal manner if the owner gives me permission. But the problem I've had with my records being released to certain reporters, they twist them and to make their point. So I think it's the press's responsibility to get their facts correct about what medications are being used and why they're being used. Because in a particular article I was involved in, the medications that were used, that were antibiotics, were implied that they were steroids. And this was done to make this reporter's point. So I think it's critical that the press handles these records accurately. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Foster. Other questions?
Yes,
Sure.
I have a comment more than a question. I very much appreciate, I'm a regulator as well as an owner and a trainer and a loudmouth. But
You mean
I
an
appreciate,
attorney at law? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes. And sometimes I'm embarrassed by it, but it's important that we say what we think and stand up for what we believe. And you all have made a real contribution to the efforts to protect the horse and the racing industry. I personally am very pleased at what I've heard. It's now the job of the regulators to put into effect many of the suggestions that have been made by your panel, not the least of which is transparency and what I refer to in the law profession as a CE program for trainers. Gary made particular reference to how much he had learned just at this conference. Well, it begins with the knowledge and the experience, and I think it's incumbent upon us as regulators to write rules that require transparency and CE programs, et cetera. And when I think of the job, 38 states we would have to do this. I'm just overwhelmed at the job ahead of us to implement what the very excellent recommendations that you all have made. But we as regulators have to take that on, whether it's by a national organization or state by state, but we cannot let this amount of information, and I listened carefully to the remarks made yesterday, they also need implementing, and it's the job of the racing industry and its regulators to take into consideration and act upon your very excellent recommendations. And thank you for exposing our problems and making recommendations for the solutions.
Steve Cook, Woodbine Racetrack. I think there's been some very important comments made here today, and I think there's certainly a role here for the regulators, but I think this is an opportunity for myself as a racetrack operator to hear from this very good panel. Do you have any particular messages you'd like the racetrack operators to receive?
Can I address that?
Sure.
Thank you. That is, I'll tell you what, that is a very unusual request. Most of the time, racetrack operators are just looking at bottom line. You know, one of the things, Steve, yesterday, I was extremely just surprised and enlightened that, you know, your starting gate, just at Woodbine investing $500,000, recognizing a problem and going out and being proactive in trying to manage that problem. Your safety record on your racing surface is phenomenal. With the number of horse starts that you have and the broad population, you know, you have done a wonderful job of really addressing the problems. It's refreshing because it's really non-existent. I shouldn't say non-existent, but it's something that really most racetrack operators do not respond to until there is a tremendous amount of pressure put on them. And I think that's If every racetrack operator would truly try and understand that the problems that they're having and horse soundness, whether it's rider safety, whether it's living conditions in the barn area, and really try and address these, our industry, it would move our industry light years forward. Thank you for being proactive in that sector.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're over our time, and Ed told me there's a trap door in this podium that's going to drop me down into it if we don't quit now. So thanks for your attention. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you. I apologize to those who had questions, but I think we need to move on. Let's shorten our break. Let's take a 10-minute break and be back at 10:25. Thank you.